Hey, 7th grade, this is Mr. Ling, and I'm making a quick video over what I was trying to go over with you today when we had such difficulty with my, I should say when I had such difficulty with my Adobe Connect session. So what I wanted to talk about really quick was dividing rational numbers. So we looked at before the associative and commutative properties of addition, right? And we said the associative property of addition was the fact that, I'm just going to highlight that yellow, was the fact that we can arrange numbers in any way and group them in different groups and then add them and we still get the same answer. And then the commutative property of addition said that, and we likened this to commuting, like commuting in a car, moving around, that we can move numbers around and order them differently and when we're adding, and we can result in the same answer. So it's the same thing with division and multiplication. So I'm going to introduce these same two properties here, and this is in the lesson. But so let's see here, the commutative property, commutative property of multiplication. And that says that the order of numbers being multiplied can be changed without affecting the product. And again, remember terminology, the product in multiplication is your answer. 3 times 5 equals 15, so 15 is the product. All right, so basically the same idea. We can move things around when we're multiplying and get the same answer. And the associative property of multiplication, and this works for division too. I should put both, multiplication / division, because it does work for both. The associative property says that the grouping of numbers being multiplied can be changed without affecting the product. All right, so, ooh, boy, I butchered that one, didn't I? The grouping of numbers being multiplied can be changed without affecting the product. Okay, and this also works for division. You could say the grouping of numbers being divided can be changed without affecting the quotient. The quotient is just your answer for a division problem. So, works the same way. All right, so that was like this example I gave you earlier in our warm-up up here when we added these two different strands of numbers, right? That's multiplying and dividing, but we moved the numbers around and we still got the same answer, okay? All right, so there's another property in multiplication called the multiplicative inverse. That's a hard one to say. The multiplicative inverse property basically says that the reciprocal, and I'm going to say in parentheses here, this is in layman's terms or common terms, the flipped version of a fraction. The reciprocal of a rational number the product of a number and its multiplicative inverse is 1. Example, I know what I did. There we go. 1 over 8 times its reciprocal, okay? So the reciprocal would be 8 over 1, which is the same thing as 8. But we'll call it 8 over 1. 8 over 1 is equal to That's it. That's what it's saying. So if you take any number and multiply it by its multiplicative inverse, okay, the multiplicative inverse is just the flipped version of that same number, then you get 1. So this number right here, this 8 over 1, and I don't think I can highlight this, is that 8 over 1 is the multiplicative inverse here in this case. I should put that in parentheses. So 8 over 1 is multiplicative inverse of 1 over 8. All right, there you go. Okay, so last thing, distributive property. What is the distributive property of multiplication? Okay, the distributive property basically says that, well, I'll give you the definition and we'll talk about it. So the definition is the product of a number and a group of numbers is the same as the sum of the individual products. Now, if you're like me, if I just see these definitions like that, they don't make much sense unless I actually do some examples. So let's do an example here. So the product of a number and a group of numbers is the same as the sum of the individual products, okay? So let's say we have an example here like, and I'm not going to use fractions here, I'm going to use whole numbers. So let's say 3 times 2 plus 7. Okay? 3 times 2 plus 7. And anytime you see this right here, when you see a number right up against a parentheses, that means multiplied by. Okay? And I'll just do this. I'm going to say that that is the same thing as 3 times 2 plus 7. Just to make sure you remember that. Some people forget that little fact right there. Okay? All right. So what the distributive property is saying is that I can distribute this 3 into this 2 and this 7 and get the same thing. So for example, if I take the 3 times 2 plus 7, okay, over here, the distributive property is saying that I can distribute this 3 into, it's my daughter texting me, to this 2, okay, and I can distribute this 3 to this 7. And this is multiplication, right? This is multiplication here. So I can rewrite this as by distributing this 3 into these other two numbers. I can say this is the same thing as 3 times 2 plus 3 times 7. Okay, and again, I've just distributed these 3 times 2, 3 times 2, and then 3 times 7. All right, and I get my answer down here would be 3 times 2 is 6 plus 3 times 7 is 21. My answer is 27. Same thing if I did this. If I distributed this, if I added that first, if I added the 2 plus the 7, this would be 3 times 9, right? 2 plus 7 is 9. So 3 times 9 is 27. Get the same answer. So distributive property just says that the product of a number and a group of numbers is the same as, go back to the definition here again, is the same as the sum of the individual products. Okay, so the individual products are down here. 3 times 2, this is the product of 3 and 2, and 3 times 7, this is the product of 3 and 7. That's it, okay? All right. So here's an example. So Andrew is making peanut butter bars for a party. He needs to figure out how many 1/8 cup servings he can get from a recipe that yields 3½ cups. Okay, so in this situation, we know that his recipe will give you basically 3.5 cups of the recipe of the peanut butter bars. And he wants to split that into 1/8 cup servings. So he needs to, just think about that for a second, what does he need to do there? Does he need to divide 3.5 by 1/8? Or does he need to multiply 3.5 by 1/8? So he needs to divide that, okay? So let's look at this again. So basically you would set it up like this. You would set it up like 1/8, sorry, that's wrong. You would set it up as 3.5 divided by 1/8, right? All right. And we want to find out what that equals. Now, normally, I would tell you, well, hey, you know what we've got to do? Well, we can set this up differently, right? If we're going to divide by 1/8, first we can use that multiplicative inverse property. We can say, okay, multiplicative inverse. I'll write it right there. Multiplicative inverse, okay? And we can flip this 1/8 and change the operation. And I've taught you this trick already. We can say, well, 3.5 divided by 1/8 is the same thing as 3.5 times its reciprocal, its multiplicative inverse, which is 8/1. Okay? That's again using the multiplicative inverse property. So now I've told you, well, you've got to actually separate, you've got to make this 3.5 an improper fraction before you can multiply it out. Well, guess what? No, you don't, because we're going to set this up differently. We're going to set this up as, and remember, 8/1, this right here is the same thing as 8, right? So we're going to rewrite this as 8 times 3.5. I'm just putting the 3.5 in parentheses. Again, that still means I'm timesing it, right? So 8 times 3.5. Now, we can use our properties here. We can say, well, 3.5 is the same thing as 3 plus 1/2, right? So we could say it's like this. 8 times 3 plus 1/2, right? All I'm doing is I'm separating out the 3 and the 1/2. It'd just be like if I had a 4. I could say 4 is split into 3 plus 1. That's still 4, right? 3 plus 1/2 is still 3.5. Well, now, guess what I can do? I can use that same distributive property I used up here. I can say this is now 8, use a different color again. I can say this is 8 times 3 plus 8 times 1/2. And I get, well, I got to use a different page here. I get, so it's 8 times 3 plus 1/2. So 8 times 3, 8 times 1/2. 8 times 3 is 24 plus 8 times 1/2. I'll do this over here. 8 times 1/2, okay, is, this is 8/1. 8 times 1 is 8/2, which is the same thing as 4, because 8 divided by 2 is 4. So I can say this is 8 times 1/2 is 4. So 24 plus 4, which equals 28. Now, I don't know about you, but I thought that was a little bit easier than actually having to change this to an improper fraction and then multiply it out. Maybe you don't think so, but the point is you get the same answer because of the distributive property. Okay? All right, so there you go. So now we know our answer. If we have, it's 28. So 28 servings. If we take, go back to the original, if we take 3.5 cups of our recipe and we want to make that into 1/8 cup servings, we will get 28 cups. And I'll cut and paste that in there so it's in the notes. Okay, that's it. I will talk about converting rational numbers in my next video because this one's getting a little long.